So tonight, Malcolm's going to be talking. We're moving on to the Exodus. We had actually planned on doing Exodus all the way up to Deuteronomy, but Malcolm did a bit of a run through at our Bible study yesterday and got to the end of Exodus in an hour, so that's all we're going to do today, and we'll do Leviticus to Deuteronomy next week. So we started with creation and early human history, going through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his sons in the land of Canaan, and 400 years has now passed when they moved to Egypt, and it starts with the people being slaves, and it talks about the rescue of these slaves in Egypt. And the Exodus is a story that's captured imagination when you think about it. There's all the movies. Think about the Ten Commandments. There's been a number of Ten Commandment movies. The Prince of Egypt, which is an incredible movie worth watching, and it has captured people through the ages. It was a big story that meant a lot to African Americans. Black Americans in slavery, really identified with the story of Exodus and the story of Moses. But Exodus is much, much deeper than an adventure, much, much deeper than just freedom, a story about freedom. It's a story that shows how God rescues, God brings freedom. And throughout it, there are all these connections. As Malcolm speaks, you might see connections between the Exodus and the New Testament. There's connections of blood and atonement when we get to the story of the circumcision. There's connection of blood and death passing over when we get to the story of Passover. There's a story of freedom through the water. A reminder of baptism when they come through the Red Sea. There's stories of grace coming before law is given. And there's the stories of how God is holy and pure and clean, and he makes us clean so we can come into his presence. All of those are seen in the Exodus. And as Malcolm speaks, you'll probably recognise these themes and be able to link them up to the New Testament. And one other theme that I think it's easy to miss in Exodus is how God uses evil circumstances for good. So think about, for example, Pharaoh worrying about the Israelite boys and the Israelite population growing, so killing all the boys. And that leads Moses' mum to place him in the reed basket, and get found by Pharaoh's daughter, and so Moses grows up in Pharaoh's household. And that happens because Pharaoh wanted to kill all the boys, and God uses that to bring a boy into his own household who could then be the one who rescues them. Or think about how Moses kills a man and has to flee. And because of that, he meets God in the burning bush. So God uses evil events and brings good out of them. That's another really constant theme through the Exodus. So with that in mind, I hand over to Malcolm now to give us our lecture.
Thanks, Graham. So this is part one, actually, of From Slavery to Freedom, because it's part one of the these last four books of Moses' corpus of his writings. And so we're just looking at Exodus tonight. And Exodus is where a lot of the narrative stories that we're familiar with come from. So it takes a while to get through it. The other three books we'll look at next week, and so we'll be able to unpack them a little bit more. Now, we can sort of say that the end in Deuteronomy, this last book, it sort of summarizes what these books are talking about, what they're doing for the people of Israel, and that is that they're teaching God's ways to them in a way that is very memorable. In Deuteronomy 6-8, Moses tells the Israelites to teach the commandments, for the commandments to be on their hearts, to teach them to their kids, to talk about them in every context. When you at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up, and to tie them on your forehead and your hands. And so this idea of a narrative wrapped around God's law is a way to really bring it to life and to make it real for the people. That's what Moses is trying to do. So we see this genre of narrative and the genre of law being mixed together all through these 4 books. Most Deuteronomy and Leviticus are more law. The other 2 books are very much narrative and law. So Exodus, of course, gets its name from coming out, the coming out of Egypt, the Exodus. So this is a picture, a photo of the Israelites when they got out of the Red Sea. Somebody took a snapshot, and you can see Moses in the background there with his staff, releasing the waters to crush the Egyptians. Obviously, this is not a photo, but a Renaissance painting or something like that. But it gives you a feel for the chaos and the number of people and the desperation. And that's a big part of the story of Exodus. Now, Exodus can actually be, like every book in the Bible, you can divide it up into pieces to try to understand it. But how do you divide it up? There's lots of ways to divide up Exodus. I'm just going to present you with 2 very simple ways. This first one is geographic. So it's when Israel is in Egypt, the first part, then Israel in the wilderness, and then Israel at Sinai, where they're getting the law. And that's a geographical division. This second way is a theological division based on what God's doing. God saves Israel from slavery in Egypt, the first part. God gives Israel his law, that's actually at Sinai, and God commands Israel to build the tabernacle, and that's actually most of the second half of the book. So personally, I prefer the second method because the Bible tends to be theologically driven, and so I think this division probably makes a bit more sense. I'm not saying that the first one doesn't make sense, but for our purposes, we'll use this first way of dividing things up. So Exodus part 1, salvation from slavery. Does anyone know what this is a picture of? It's a bit obscure.
I know the answer because I was there on Sunday.
Yeah, there's a hint here, this thing here, that gives you a hint of the location. So it's one of the plagues. It's probably the plague of hail crashing down over Egypt. So that's a part of this first part of the story. Now the story starts several hundred years on from where we left off at the end of Genesis. And there's a twist in the story. Egypt, which was a land of refuge for Jacob's children, is now a land of slavery for them. So the security that they sought out in human, in a human nation state or a state has become slavery. And I think that's a warning to us that if we seek out security in human means, that will become slavery. We're introduced to Moses and his unique circumstances. So Graham mentioned that Pharaoh tried to destroy Moses. Moses was born in the midst of this persecution where all male children were being executed, so his mother wanted to rescue him. She put him in a basket like this. This is an Egyptian basket from a couple of centuries before Moses, so it would have been something like that. And Pharaoh's daughter finds him and adopts him. So Moses grows up in the palace as a part of the Egyptian royalty. But he obviously identifies himself with Israel, with his fellow brothers and sisters of Israel. And he ends up killing an Egyptian who's oppressing an Israelite and then is found out and flees to Midian. Midian is on the other side of Sinai in Arabia. Although the Midianites, and we'll mention this a little bit later, the Midianites are not limited at this time just to that land. They're nomads, so they travel into Sinai and all around. And Moses ends up settling down and marrying a Midianite woman. And so, so that you can get a sense of the context, this is an excavation in Tel Adaba in the Egyptian delta, in the Nile Delta, which shows evidence of Semite inhabitants. Now, the Semites, the sons of Shem, included Abraham and his children, Jacob, the Israelites. So the Israelites were Semites. So we have evidence that there were Semites living in Egypt at this time, and the evidence shows that they had become increasingly Egyptianized. So the evidence, like their pottery and the burial methods and stuff like that, shows this shift in culture over time to become more and more Egyptian. But nonetheless, we have evidence that they were there. So the Israelites, in the midst of their slavery, they cry out to God. And God hears them, and he responds by confronting Moses at the burning bush, the bush that didn't burn, but was on fire. And he calls Moses. And Moses responds to this call rather reluctantly. I don't know if you've heard the passage or read the passage, but Moses basically gets into a bit of a debate with God about how much he can manage, and God dismisses all his concerns and ends up appointing him and his brother Aaron to this role that he's called them to. So Moses heads back to Egypt, and on the way there's this weird interruption that gives us a real feel for how different our cultures are, our culture and this ancient culture, because it's hard to make sense of it. So at a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah, that's Moses' wife, the Midianite woman, took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched Moses' feet with it and said, "Surely you're a bridegroom of blood to me." So he let him alone. It was then that she said, "A bridegroom of blood," because of the circumcision. That just sounds weird, doesn't it? Like, what's going on? Who's he? Who did what? Like, Zipporah cut off her son's foreskin, we know that much, but what else is going on here? Who did she call a bridegroom, and why? And it gets even more confusing when we look at the Hebrew. Normally it's the other way around, but this isn't the Hebrew. This is just a slightly more faithful translation. You'll notice here, Zipporah took a flint knife and she cut off the foreskin of her son and she touched his feet, it says here, whereas here it says she touched Moses' feet. The Hebrew doesn't mention Moses at all. So it's just she touched his feet. So also, feet is a euphemism, a Hebrew euphemism for genitalia. So she touched whoever this guy's genitalia, not his feet. So, and then she called whoever it was a bridegroom of blood. So if it was Moses, he's not a bridegroom because he's a groom, he's a husband. If it was her son, he's not a bridegroom because he's her son. And the other meaning for this word bridegroom is actually son-in-law, and neither Moses nor her son are sons-in-law either. So what's going on? The best explanation that I've heard is that the Midianites, so Moses, being brought up an Egyptian, probably didn't understand circumcision properly and so hadn't circumcised his son properly. The Egyptians did do circumcision, but they just did a little snip of the very end. I'm not sure if you need that detail, but you've got it anyway. But the Midianites, because remember they're descended from Abraham through Keturah, his second wife, so the Midianites understood how proper circumcision worked, but they had their own rituals, and so the best explanation is that all of this stuff is part of the Midianite ritual of circumcision. So she was talking about the circumcision, this stuff about bridegroom of blood to me. is part of the ritual of circumcision. And God is the he who left him alone and the he who was going to kill him, the Yahweh. It actually says Yahweh. And so God was satisfied by the proper circumcision that Zipporah carried out on Moses' son. What makes this interesting is that the context of this is immediately before this, God has just finished telling Moses what he's going to tell to Pharaoh. And the last thing that God says is, I say to you, so this is for Moses to say to Pharaoh, I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. My son is Israel. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. So God has just told Moses that he is going to threaten to kill Pharaoh's firstborn son. And Moses, on the way to Israel, has this encounter with God where God is going to kill his son. And I think what this shows is that even though we don't understand a lot of the rituals and stuff, God is holy and he expects his people to be holy. He doesn't have multiple standards. He has one standard, and the only way that his people can approach him is to be obedient and holy. So that's a heads up for Moses. God is serious. So Moses gets back to Egypt. He talks with the elders of Israel, and then he goes and confronts the Pharaoh. And he asks the Pharaoh to let the Israelites hold a feast to Yahweh in the wilderness. This sounds like a weird thing to ask, but it's actually part of Egyptian industrial relations law. And so Moses isn't asking something that's unreasonable. He's asking something that's already a part of Egyptian practice. And yet Pharaoh says no. And so Moses refers him to fair work. Well, he doesn't, but Pharaoh is being unreasonable, and they both know that. In fact, Pharaoh goes beyond that and he forces the Israelites to make straw. So he's really out of line. Now, to give you a feel for Egyptian culture and what was going on, the clash between Israel and Egypt, we know that Israelite culture is about one God, right, who's made a covenant with them. Egyptian culture is very different. It's very, very religious. This is a solar boat from the temple, dug up just in front of the Great Pyramid, the Pyramid of Khufu. So a solar boat was for him to sail across the sky in his death, and they buried this for that purpose, perhaps. That's how serious they were about their religious practice. These are some of the gods, some of the major gods, Amen, Ka, Ra, Thoth. You'll see that they have animal forms, some of them, ibis, owl, and they have different animal forms as well. And this is a temple of Ramesses II in Abu Simbel, and these are 4 statues of Ramesses II, who was a very humble man. And this is his wife here, who was very important to him because she was as high as half his thigh. And that's one of his kids. And this is probably Ra in the form of an owl here, or a falcon. The temple was dedicated to Ra, Ptah, and Amun. So these 3 guys. And everything in Egypt was like this. It was dedicated to the gods. Egypt was very, very religious. Part of the reason for this is because of the geographic nature of Egypt. This is a photo of the Nile from one side of Aswan across to the other. Aswan is down here. On the Nile. It's down like here or somewhere like that. It's not that far down. Is it that far down?
Yeah, I reckon it is.
Okay. It's down in the south, but not too far, because that's Sudan nowadays. But you can see here how narrow the fertile strip of land is of the Nile. You can see the fertile land there, and then just beyond it there's the desert. And a lot of the Nile is like that, as you can see. This is a picture of Egypt in 1400 BC or so. And it's more fertile than Egypt now, which has very pronounced, this desert's just desert. It's only the delta here. And Goshen, where the Israelites, was here in the eastern edge of the delta. So they lived in a fertile area. And most of the action is, the action in the plagues is around here. And because the Nile is the lifeblood of Egypt, it's very religious, right? The Nile is a very central religious aspect of Egyptian life. This is actually a picture of Amenhotep II, who's probably the pharaoh of the exile. You can actually go and see him in person, in his body, if you go to Egypt. His mummy is on display in the Egyptian Museum, but that's a statue of him. And Moses and Aaron confronted him after the Israelites complained about their hard labour. And one of the interesting things is that they consistently confronted him in his palace. So imagine if somebody wanted to confront the US, some little country, I don't know, Jamaica or something, wanted to confront the US, and they went to the White House to say, you are in trouble, you'd better do what we tell you or our God is going to destroy you. That's the sort of thing that was going on. It's just incredible. And it's important to realise that all of this, like I've been talking about these real people from the New Kingdom of Egypt, from the 18th dynasty, and this is what we read about in Exodus. Everything fits the history that we have of the Exodus. There's actually a historian that we get our Egyptian timelines from, a Greek historian from the 3rd century, and he mentions Moses in his history. So in the history that mentions all of the Egyptian timelines, it mentions Moses, but we don't want to recognise that because, you know, the Bible's all fantasy. So there's so much evidence for the historicity of this account. So one of the things that Moses and Aaron find themselves in is that they're confronting Pharaoh, but they're also confronting their own people. And they have to do that, well, for the rest of their lives, basically, because what they're doing causes changes, and people don't like change. And it also causes hardship, and people don't like that. And Pharaoh doesn't respond very well to Moses and Aaron's requests. He, throughout the story, numerous times, dozens of times, it says that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, or Pharaoh hardened his heart, or the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. And there's this really strong theme throughout the story of God and Pharaoh working together to resist God. So God's actually enabling Pharaoh to resist God's will so that God's will can be done. It's this really ironic sort of work where God is using the wickedness of man to bring about his glory. And God actually says that that's what he's going to do. And he does it. Now, the big part of this is the plagues. So Moses and God say that they're going to visit plagues on Egypt if they don't let the people go, and they do. There's 10 plagues, and there's lots of details about these plagues. Lots of ways to divide them up. You can divide them up in groups of 2, like if we go back to that picture, it's easier to see. The first 2 are the Nile, second two are insects, third two are disease, then stuff from the sky, and then darkness and death. You can divide them up into three. I can't exactly remember how that works, but you can do it. And actually, if you look at the literary variety, the way that Exodus is written, which is beautiful, like the way that Genesis is written, very literary and very good storytelling, Moses has written this account so that you won't get bored. So he varies all of these things so that the plagues have this constant rhythm and variation to them. So there's 3 plagues in these cycles, and they have similar introductions and varying natures and lengths, so that there's a pattern, but not a boring pattern to the story. But you can also recognize that the plagues had a purpose. They weren't just arbitrary things. So each of the plagues is showing God's sovereignty over Egyptian gods. So, for example, the first plague, the Nile turns to blood. Remember, the Nile was one of the central aspects of Egyptian religion, and Apsis and Isis were the god and goddesses of the Nile, and they were very important gods. And Khnum was the guardian of the Nile, and in turning the Nile to blood, God showed complete control over them and over their environment. And then the frogs from the Nile, Heket is a frog-headed goddess of birth. God defeated her. Set was a god of gnats, the god of the desert, and the gnats were his domain, and he was beaten by God in the next plague. And it just goes on and on. And notably, in the 9th plague, the plagues sort of escalate. So by the time you get to the locusts, the Egyptians are in big trouble because their harvest has been destroyed and they've lost a lot of their animals. Their economy is in strife. They're really in trouble. And the Israelites, you'll notice here, from the death of the livestock, well, actually from the plague of flies on, the Israelites were spared from these things. So the plagues were very specific and targeted in miraculous ways. You know, it doesn't make sense that these would be targeted in this way, but even the hail and stuff like that was targeted. It didn't touch the Israelites. And somehow Pharaoh managed to maintain his stubbornness in the midst of this incredible, clearly supernatural power that was devastating his nation. And by the time that the plague of darkness comes, Egypt is on its knees. And the plague of darkness really targets Pharaoh because Ra is the sun god, the god of the sun, and Ra is the god that's most closely identified with the Pharaoh. And so the plague of darkness is really targeting the Pharaoh directly. And of course, the final plague, the death of the firstborn, including the firstborn of Pharaoh, directly targets Pharaoh. And so Yahweh doesn't leave Pharaoh untouched. The whole of Egypt is devastated by this time. And so Pharaoh says, okay, get out of here. Now the Passover. This is another photo from the Passover. This is a negative, so I don't have the positive. Just joking. It's a woodcut from probably the 15th century. But this is a lovely picture because even though it's done in the style of 15th century Northern Europe, you can see all the details. The angel of death is putting to death the firstborn sons, but the Israelites here are gathered together. They've painted blood, the blood of the sacrificed lamb, on their doorposts, and so they're safe. They're passed over by the angel of death, and they're eating this meal of the sacrificed lamb in a hurry, ready to go. They've got their staffs there. They're ready to go. They've got the unleavened bread, which they cooked in a hurry, and they're just grabbing the Passover lamb, and they'll be leaving. And so this incredible event, which is celebrated still today in Judaism, is a very powerful type for, we talked about typology last week, and so this is a very powerful type of the sacrifice of Christ. There's so many things in this. The fact that we too are going to be the target of death. We will all die. But if the blood of the Lamb is painted on the doors of our hearts, then we will be passed over by death. Our sins will be forgiven, and we won't die. We'll die physically, but we won't die spiritually. And we celebrate something that reminds us constantly of this, where we eat the bread and drink the blood of Christ in communion. And so Passover is something that for us continues also as Christians, continues to this day, the reminders of this. And it sets us free, just as the Israelites were set free from slavery in Egypt, we're set free from slavery of sin. So, so this is such a powerful story for all of us as Christians and Jews. This is one of the things that they ate in Passover, and also in the story, if you read the story of Exodus, Passover happens and God has a couple of extra little laws to tell the people before they leave Egypt. One of them is to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is unleavened bread. And it's a reminder of this dependence on God and this obedience to him and letting go of the things of this world in a way. And also the consecration of the firstborn. Because while the Egyptians lost their firstborn children to death, God still owns every firstborn. God owns everyone. The firstborn is a representative of the whole family. And so God asks for the firstborn of everything in Israel to be consecrated to him. For animals, they're sacrificed. For human beings, they're redeemed by the sacrifice of an animal. And so it's a reminder that we all belong to God. And it sort of tells us what the plagues mean, that God is in control and we all belong to him. So the Israelites head out of Egypt. God leads them in a pillar of fire by night and a pillar of cloud during the day. And this stays with them until they cross the Jordan 40 years later and make it into the Promised Land. And so God's personally with them this whole time. They cross over the Red Sea. This is a big deal. It's not a small part of the story, it's a big deal. But where do they cross over the sea? There's lots of different explanations. I've got some videos that I'll refer to you that talk about this at length. It's possible that they passed over the Red Sea. The Red Sea in the original language actually means Yam is Hebrew for sea or large body of water. Sometimes the Nile is called Yam. And Saf is probably an Egyptian word for reeds. So it's Sea of Reeds. So it could have been these lakes and this area up here, which back in this time was covered in water. Some people think it's down here, actually over the other side. Sorry, I'll show you in this bigger map. Can you see where that is? So the Gulf of Aqaba. So on the eastern side of Sinai. So there's some debate over where this happened, but there's not a lot of debate among Christians about whether it happened or not. It's such a key part to Jewish belief, and for Christians, this again is a type. It's a type of baptism. So Paul talks about how we pass through the waters of baptism, just as the just as the Israelites passed through the waters of the Red Sea and were led out of slavery into freedom. So this is a core part of our belief as well as Jewish belief. Now the appropriate response to that is praise, songs of praise. And the Bible, Exodus, suddenly breaks into this poetry. And it's beautiful. You've probably sung this song, you know, I will sing unto the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously, the horse and rider thrown into the sea. Probably know that song from scripture and song and stuff. And the Jews sang that with gusto, as they should have. And this psalm gives us an insight into their culture, into the way that they saw God as a warrior, into the way that they responded to these sorts of events. And it also starts this tradition that we're still a part of today, that we worship God in praise and song. So it's very powerful and important too. They got into Sinai, or the wilderness of Shur. No, I think this is the desert of Sin. And God gave them manna. Manna, which is bread from heaven, is of course evidence of God's providence for Israel. There's no way to understand it other than miraculous, and it stopped when they got to the Promised Land again. And it also indicates the dependence of Israel on him, how they're dependent on him. And the Israelites actually came to really bitterly resent this. They really resented this dependence on God, and they complained about the manna. When they first tasted it, they said it tasted like honey and sesame seeds. Yum. You know, those sesame bars that you can get, honey and sesame. Tasted like that. And then by the end of the time, they were like, it tastes disgusting. Halfway through, it tastes like olive oil, and by the end, it was just garbage. So that sounds like us, doesn't it? When God gives us something, we get sick of it and we become ungrateful. So, yeah, that's a human problem. This is possibly, this spring is called Uyun Musa, which means Moses' spring. And it's possibly the spring called Mara, which was the spring of bitterness. The Israelites ran, as they got into the wilderness, there was less and less water. They came to this spring and it tasted bitter. And of course they had a big pout, a big sulk. And Moses sweetened it by throwing in a tree and made the waters sweet. And this is an example that happened over and over. The Israelites just complained about everything. A bit further on, they didn't have any water at all. There weren't any springs. And so in this story, Moses, God says, behold, I'll stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. So Horeb is actually Mount Sinai. And you shall strike the rock and water shall come out of it and the people will drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. Now, you may have heard this story. And there's a parallel story in Numbers, much later on, where God says to Moses, on the right-hand side of the slide here, tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water, so you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle. But Moses doesn't tell the rock, instead he strikes it. And God gets angry with him. In fact, Moses doesn't get to go to the Promised Land. So what's going on here? Why is there such a difference? I was reading a geographic commentary that was, the author had lived in this area and he lived with the Bedouin, and he said that even today the Bedouins will strike the rocks with their staff and water will come out. And what they're doing is they understand the rocks, they can see them, they know how they work, and they can see that there is a hidden stream there that's been crusted over with rock because of the calcium in the rock. It's all travertine rocks. And so they strike this place and it cracks the crust and the water spurts out. So they're actually using desert craft. And the suggestion is that this first time, Moses was using the skills that he'd learned in the 40 years in the desert. So it was a natural thing. It was something that was amazing to the Israelites because they lived in Egypt. But after a while, it got boring. You know, it was just another thing that they could do. It was another naturalistic thing. And so this last time in Numbers, God wanted to actually show that he had the power to give his people water, that he was the water of life. And so he asked Moses to just speak and the water would come out, which would demonstrate that this was not Moses' desert craft, it was God's power. But Moses couldn't help himself. He was in the habit of being in control of using human means to deal with these stroppy Israelites. And so that's what he did. And he prevented God's power from being seen. And that was the opposite of what God wanted. And that's why God punished him. And again, this is something that we do, isn't it? This is something, as somebody who's been a pastor, this really strikes close to my heart, that too often we use our own strength, our own power, when we should be standing back a bit and letting God move. And he will. So that's a lesson from Moses.
20 minutes to go.
Yep. So now we get to God's law, Mount Sinai. And this is actually from the tip of what most people believe is Mount Sinai, and down there you can see St. Catherine's Monastery, which is where the Codex Sinaiticus was discovered. So this is the 10 Commandments. I won't read them out. You're probably familiar with them. There's 10 of them. The first 4, up to the Sabbath, refer to how we relate to God. The second 6 tell us how we relate to our fellow human beings. And in this, it tells us there's so many profound concepts in here that our civilization is built upon. Things like a day of rest built into nature, the sanctity of human life, the exclusivity of marriage, the value of private property, the importance of honesty, and the value of satisfaction with one's lot. All of these things are built into these 10 Commandments, as brief as they are. And after the 10 Commandments, God goes on to detail further laws that sort of expand on these commandments. So the rest of chapter 20, which is where the 10 Commandments are, is about the number 1 priority, which is also the first commandment, and the second commandment, and the third and the fourth commandment, how to worship God. But God is specifically talking about how to build altars. Then the second set of laws that he talks about is how to treat slaves, which is dealing with how to treat your fellow human being, but talking in a context which was the context that the Israelites had just come out of. So God really wanted them to understand that you are not to treat anyone like you've just been treated. That was a real priority for the Israelites. And then he talks about what happens when people sin against you. How do you deal with that? So laws about restitution. How do you administer a just society? And then social laws. How do you create a righteous society? What sort of things do you do to live well together? And finally, it sort of comes back around to how do you worship God? How do you implement Sabbath and festivals? So actually all festivals were called Sabbaths. So the Sabbath and the Sabbaths. And finally, chapter 23 closes with a warning about the Canaanites and their corrupting practices. They were a religious people too. Everyone was religious back then. And God is warning Moses to warn the people about not getting corrupted by the religious practices of the Canaanites. And chapter 24 concludes with a confirmation of the covenant. This is now the Mosaic covenant. And then God moves on to how to build a tabernacle. And the whole of the last section, basically half of Exodus, is about the tabernacle, its furnishings, and the priests' clothes mostly, because you've got to be well dressed. This is a model of the tabernacle in Timnah in the Negev desert in Israel. I found out where it was. You can go and visit it if you want to, although I wouldn't recommend doing that right at the moment. This is what it might have looked like in the middle of the camp. The tabernacle was placed at the center of the camp with the tribes in a prescribed pattern around it. So you can see that pattern here. These middle ones are all the different families or clans of the Levites. So the Levites are all around the tabernacle, and they do most of the moving and packing of the tabernacle when it's moved. And the tribes are in this prescribed formation around it. It's really important that the tabernacle's at the center, I think, of the camp. God is in the midst of his people. He doesn't want to just sit outside. The tabernacle has a particular design, a particular architecture that is important. One, it's made of luxurious materials, gold, silver, bronze, beautiful scarlet, purple and blue cloth, expensive leather. And so it reflects the beauty of God. And the decorations remind the people of Eden, the place of delight. It has a fence, a curtain all around it. You can't just stumble into the tabernacle. You have to actually enter it through this entrance at the front here. It's quite a wide entrance, but you've got to go through this because before you can go through that, you have to be clean. So we'll talk about this a bit next week with Leviticus, but you have to be clean before you can go into the tabernacle. But it's not enough to be clean to approach God. You have to be holy to approach God. How do you get holy? You need a sacrifice. And so the altar is here. You can't get through to the tabernacle without passing the altar, making a sacrifice and a ritual cleansing. And so this architecture is really significant because it tells us about the nature of God, that he is holy. Even though he's in the middle of his people, he's still holy. That's the altar, made of acacia wood wrapped in bronze so that they could carry it, and it's big enough to put whole cattle on. And it got used a lot because there were daily sacrifices. Once you got into the building of the tabernacle, there's a similar architecture inside. There's the holy place, this first part here, where the table of showbread, the menorah, the lampstand, and the altar of incense are constantly showing. The altar of incense is burning incense that shows the holiness of God. The table of showbread shows God's presence again with his people, and the lampstand gives the only light. But the priest would go in here daily, but the Holy of Holies was a very holy place, and only the high priest could go in there. And once the temple was built, it was once a year. Even I think in the tabernacle, when it wasn't being disassembled, the priest only had reason to go in here on the Day of Atonement. So, so this is a really holy place, and it shows God's true holiness, and God's presence is sort of here in the mercy seat on the top, on the cover of the Ark of the Covenant. So we'll see the Ark of the Covenant looks like this. Inside it is the tablet of the Ten Commandments and Aaron's staff that budded, which comes later, and a little bowl of manna so that the Israelites could remember God's provision. And it should be noted that you couldn't touch the ark. You could only carry it by these poles. So the poles were never removed from the ark so that you never had to touch it. This is the priest's clothing. And the priest's clothing also had significance. It meant things. These are the 12 tribes of Israel represented as stones on his breastplate before God. All of his clothes have significance and meaning and purpose. I won't go into that, but if you look at some of the resources, they'll talk about it. And so these things all reminded the people of who God was. Moses had no sooner received all these instructions from God than he came down the hill and came down the mountain, and the Israelites had built a golden calf. Probably something like this. This is an Egyptian apis bull, which was a common religious symbol in Egypt. And the Israelites thought, in contradiction to the second commandment, that they could somehow make God understandable to them, that they could make him concrete, that they could represent him somehow so that they could understand him and perhaps control him. And of course, that's not what God is like, and God specifically bans that. And so Moses was a bit annoyed. So he smashed the tablets that God had inscribed the Ten Commandments on, and there were lots of other things that happened. God said, "I'm going to leave the Israelites behind," and Moses said, no, please don't do that. I identify with them. And God said, they can just go to the promised land by themselves without me. And Moses said, no, that won't work. You've got to come. We may as well be dead if you don't come with us. And so, but things needed to be done. And so the Levites went through the camp and killed 3,000 people, sort of randomly, it seems. Sounds a bit harsh, but the sin of the Israelites was so great. And Yahweh sent a plague. We don't know how many people that killed. But it's a reminder that the Israelites, if they practice Egyptian religion, they'll suffer Egyptian punishment. And they do. So after that, Moses goes back up to the mountain and gets his commands. And he actually builds a little tent outside the camp where he meets with God, because God is too holy to be inside the camp without these protections of the tabernacle that I've just talked about, the sacrifices and the priest and these things. And then the tabernacle is built, and it's that's what the rest of Exodus is. It sort of repeats all of these instructions, but now it's saying all of these things were done. And the amazing thing about this is that the Holy Spirit, this is the second time that the Holy Spirit is directly referred to in Scripture. First time is when he's hovering over the waters in creation. The second time is when it says this, that the Lord said to Moses, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every craft. And behold, I have appointed him with Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have given to all able men ability that they may make all that I have commanded you." The people provided all the materials, and these men who were moved by the Spirit of God built the tabernacle and all the furnishings. Does that remind you of something? I was just thinking it really reminds me of the Scriptures. Just as God inspired the authors of Scripture, but used their personalities, their skills, their abilities, but worked in them to create the Scriptures, and then used people to copy them and to translate them. So God did this to show himself to the Israelites, to be present with them in the midst of the camp. And so God was present with his people just as he is today. But of course, we are closer to God because the Holy Spirit dwells in us. And God's presence came and filled the tabernacle. And Exodus ends this way. This is the end of Exodus, the last verses. "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel, through all their journeys. So in a very real way, the tabernacle is like the Spirit and the Word for us as Christians today. It's God's presence. It's what the people obeyed. It's what they followed. And it set the course for them. It's where they met with God. Such an amazing thing. And half of Exodus is about this. So what are the lessons that we take away from Exodus? I think I'm on time.
Yeah, perfect.
God is sovereign. The plagues, the Ten Commandments, Sinai, the desert, the rebellion, all of these things tell us that God is sovereign. He has power over every other god. He has power over nature. He has power over people. But he's not just this bossy God. He's gracious. He rescues Israel. Exodus is the story of rescue. He doesn't destroy Egypt. He could have wiped Egypt off the face of the earth. All of those plagues, he could have just killed everyone. But he didn't. Not even close. He left Egypt, and Egypt is still there today. And he redeemed Israel even after they rejected him. He brought them back, and he continued to follow them. He continued to dwell in their midst because he wants to. He wants to be with us. It doesn't make any sense. There's no reason for it. We're such miserable whingers like the Israelites. And yet God wants to be with them. As a father, I want my child to want to be with me, but I want to be with my child as well. I want my daughter to be somebody that I want to be with, but God is better than that. Even when his children are horrible and rebellious and totally unlovable, he still wants to be with them. And so it's just this incredible love. That's what Exodus is about. And so the resources that you can look at, there's some great resources here, by the way. I found some really good videos on, Graham found a couple of great videos on the Exodus. Did the Israelites really cross the Red Sea? And Exodus Explorers and Chariot Parts, that's about the crossing of the Red Sea. I found a couple of great ones. Graham found this one too, Yahweh in Egypt, which is about the name of Yahweh on a temple in Egypt from the time of the judges. It's the first mention of Yahweh. Oh no, that's a different thing. So this Yahweh in Egypt.
I think from the time of the Exodus.
It is, yeah. It's the, yeah, I was thinking of the first mention of the term Israel, which is in a temple from the time of the judges. This is Yahweh, which is actually from the 14th century, so from the time of the Exodus, when the Israelites were probably wandering around, there's this mention in Egypt in an inscription. It's the people, the nomads of Yahweh is what they're called. And then there's these fantastic videos on the Tabernacle, 3D CGI, that makes it really come to life. I would have loved to show you, but it's better if you watch it yourself, especially for those who are online. And also this video goes into, basically reads out the construction of the tabernacle and shows you how the tabernacle was put together. Really interesting. Then these great books, the commentary, the geographic commentary that I mentioned, That's a wonderful book, although it's a bit expensive. And a wonderful, wonderful book that we'll be referring to, well, I will be, throughout the Old Testament is Longman and Dillard, an introduction to the Old Testament, which goes through all the Old Testament books and gives you their historical background, the theological sort of summary, and their literary genre and type and stuff. Very, very useful. I use that anytime I'm going to preach on an Old Testament passage to get my context and stuff. And finally, this wonderful web article that gives you 10 evidences, the top 10 evidences for Moses and the Exodus. And it's fairly recent, and it's on this great BibleArchaeology.org website, which has heaps of good stuff on it. So if you go there, be prepared to spend the rest of your week doing stuff there. So there you go.
Fantastic, Malcolm. I know for me, whenever I read Exodus, I get to the 10 Commandments and then I get bored. And that's where the Bible gets hard for the next 3 or 4 books. But it's really good to actually go through it like that and understand there's relevance in the tabernacle. There's that God's telling the Israelites something, and if we can understand what he was telling the Israelites, it helps us understand how we relate to him. Same thing with all those laws. If we can understand what he was trying to tell the Israelites, even if these laws don't apply to us today, some do, some don't, if we can understand what he was telling the Israelites, it helps us understand God's character and nature and how we relate to him. So I really appreciated that. And of course, there are these stories where God kills, and these are quite hard for us to understand. And we're really going to get to that when we get to the Judges and Joshua, which I think is my one to do. So I'm sure we'll get into that in quite a bit of detail. How can we reconcile that with a loving God? But it is helpful to remember that there's so much, if you go back to your summary page, there's so much grace seen in Exodus, and there are ways that God saves, and there's opportunities to be saved for people. Like the Egyptians could have put the blood. They would have heard what was happening. They could have put blood on the door. So that even within it, there is potential grace still there. But I'm sure we'll get to Holy War in a few times, and we'll have a bit of a discussion about that then. So, opening it up to questions. Anyone want to make any comments, thoughts, or questions?